Welcome to the 2013 Summer Conference of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion at St Anne's College in the University of Oxford. This conference has as its theme the second-person perspective in science and the humanities. And my name is Dr. Andrew Pinsent. I'm the Research Director of the Ian Ramsey Centre. Our conference last year had the title Persons and Their Brains. And when I was opening the conference, I mentioned in passing that theology took a maternal interest in the notion of persons, that persons had actually come out of theology over 1,600 years ago. And for some people, that was actually new. So what I decided this year was that I would give a brief opening presentation on the theme of the origins of the term person, and how the term person has, in my view, become an orphaned term in philosophy today. And it's against that background that the research into second-person relatedness is, I think, so significant today, and in fact is really opening an extraordinary new field of interdisciplinary research. So first part of my talk is orphaned personhood. Modern philosophical discussions involving persons often have a strong ethical focus or motivation. And references to persons in the middle of a debate will often signal an implicit or explicit ethical matters being discussed. To give two examples, the humanity formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, with its injunction against treating persons simply as a means to an end. And a contemporary example, Professor Timothy Chappell, who was here last year, succinctly defined persons as belonging to the primary moral constituency. With this ethical focus, the main tasks of philosophical argument have been to determine the extent of application of the term person and how exactly persons or things connected to persons should be treated. Now, of course, if one's discussing how much one can extend the term person, one cannot completely avoid considerations of ontology. But the way debates tend to be framed these days is that they start from the premise that at least some human beings are persons, and then they argue about how far this attribution can be extended or restricted. And a fairly common strategy is to select some commonly recognized attribute of commonly acknowledged persons, such as rationality or self-consciousness, and to use that as a marker to signify membership of the category, and then argue about the kinds of beings that can be included on this basis. So it's sort of customary in talks of this kind to refer fairly early on to Peter Singer, so here he is. So Peter Singer here is debating whether animals should be called persons, and what he was suggesting in How We Are to Live, Ethics in an Age of Self-Interest, is that there may be some animals that we might wish to refer to as persons, and the criteria being to ask the question of whether any non-human animals are rational and self-conscious beings, aware of themselves as distinct entities with a past and a future. To give another example, very typical, popular level of debate, discussion in our newspapers. This was an article from the Daily Telegraph in 2006, also all debates about human cloning and so on, and the headline was, "Is this really a person?" Now, in such debates, the term person is really being used as little more for its ethical function. So personhood is whatever it is, if anything at all, that is added to being a human being, or possibly other beings, to signal membership of the primary moral constituency. And there's a kind of sleight of hand going on here, because the way these debates are framed, they subtly sidestep the question of what a person is. In fact, quite often, persons are actually redundant in the way the arguments are formulated. So if, for example, membership of the primary moral constituency depends upon having a distinct, persisting, incommunicable consciousness, well, why bother with the category of persons in these debates at all? Now, we do, of course. Persons carry metaphoric connotations, powerful metaphoric connotations, which is one reason why they're not yet redundant. But in the formal structure of the arguments, they're often somewhat redundant. Well, why is the question so difficult? Why is the question, what is a person, why is it so difficult? And I think part of the reason, the fact that it is difficult is one of the reasons why debates on this topic tend to be subtly avoided or sidestepped, or inadequate definitions, the few standard definitions, really keep being trotted out again and again. Considered biologically, the question, what is man, can be answered in reference to the genus of man in the Porphyrian tree. That's fairly standard. Man is a rational animal. If we discovered rational Martians, we could say man is a rational terrestrial animal. But what's the genus of a person? What's the species of a person? Where do they fit in Porphyrian trees? Where do they fit in other modes of categorizing the world of being? They seem to stand alone. A second way of approaching the question might be, with reference to some commonly shared experience. So if we're asking what a thing is, or trying to explain what a thing is to someone else, we might refer to some commonly shared experience of a particular thing, enabling us to say, that's the thing in question. Moreover, the fact that there is a commonly shared experience of persons, and this experience is unique, is one reason why this term person is not redundant, and indeed why it appears so often in ethical debate. Nevertheless, the standard tools of philosophy, I suggest, have not worked well in the past when attempts have been made to try to refine and express what is commonly experienced and denoted by the term person. And this inadequacy, I think, can be traced back to the origins of persons in theology. Now, there's a certain forgetfulness about these origins. So if you look at introductions or reference works or dictionaries of philosophy, the theological history of the word often tends to be a little bit forgotten. Not always, but quite often it will begin, for example, with Locke. But the word person originally came from the Latin word persona, and also there are two Greek words, hypostasis or prosopon, associated with the word person in English today. That which became the term person was actually introduced to solve a problem. It was an indispensable new principle to solve a set of theological controversies that lasted for several centuries. Now, the link between this new principle and the resolution of these problems was so strong that you might say that revealed theology and the category of person developed symbiotically. So this was the kind of problem that people were trying to solve. So here's a statement from the Gospel of John. I and the Father are one. John 10:30. One what? It's a neuter Greek word. The only word that was acceptable to Christianity in the end was substance. I and the Father are one substance. So in the Creed, the word consubstantial, homoousios, appears. But then we've got a problem. How then do we find the I bit and the Father bit if we've already used the word substance? Well, if the Father, Son, and Spirit are one substance, they can't be distinct substances. Then we've got tritheism, but they can't be accidents either. That's what early Christianity called modalism. The fundamental problem is that metaphysics was using the category is really inspired by biology, and biology alone is insufficient. We needed a further category, the category of person. Now, whether or not we would ever have developed that category without theology is an unanswerable question, but what does seem clear is that Christian theology would be extremely difficult without persons. It's curious just to trace some of the longer-term social implications of this, because once we defined Father, Son, and Spirit in theology as persons, human beings quickly became defined as persons as well, bearing at least some of the same connotations of holiness or sanctity. To the best of my knowledge, the genesis of this development has not been traced in detail, but the probable origin is another Christian doctrine, divine adoption, by which a human being becomes an adopted child of God, and hence the Christian prayer, Our Father. This is the sort of thing that's now become so much part of our social fabric, we tend to forget how revolutionary it would have been back in the days of the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, a human being was a rational animal. That was perhaps one of the best appellations that could be given, or a citizen, or 90% of the population were slaves. And for the slaves, they were just often talked about as talking instruments. If you want to see a really revolutionary change in people's thinking, I recommend the very short letter at the end of the New Testament called the letter of Philemon. And it's often missed out when people read the New Testament, but it's written on behalf of a slave to a master. And the slave has escaped from his master, and both the master and the slave have become Christians. So St. Paul has a very difficult diplomatic job. But what's extraordinary is this term when he refers to the slave as the brother of his master. Another little excursus, social and legal implications of persons. Well, we're sitting in one of them, Oxford University. Oxford University is a corporate person. And again, it's something we tend to take for granted in our legal system. A part of the origins of the Western legal tradition in the 12th and 13th century involved the development of the term person applied to corporations, including universities and later what became the modern corporation. So the question is, have persons become orphaned? A very good little book, Robert Spainman's book, Persons, the difference between someone and something. What Spainman suggests is without Christian theology, we would have no name for what we now call persons. And since persons do not simply occur in nature, we would have been without them altogether. Now, he doesn't say that means that we cannot speak intelligibly of persons without explicitly theological suppositions. But he does suggest, without the theological dimension, the idea in the long term might disappear. Well, philosophers have been working on trying to give a philosophical understanding of persons for most of the last 1,500 years. And one of the most famous definitions, the Boethian definition, an individual substance of rational nature. Well, that expresses some aspects of what is commonly termed a person, but has long been recognized as unsatisfactory. In fact, it could even be seen as a retrograde step. It could be seen as an attempt to write the concept back into a classical way of thinking of substance and accident, a particular species of substance, and thereby reintroducing the very problems that the new principle was introduced to solve. I think there's a deeper problem at play here. All language has to relate sooner or later to some kind of metaphoric understanding, which itself relates words to embodied experience. But philosophy has tended to draw principally from two root metaphors, both of which are inadequate. By the way, because when I'm teaching, I always tell to my students, avoid sweeping generalizations. If you have to make them, try to subcontract them to someone else to do the dirty work. So I'm going to subcontract this one. Science and Spirituality by Michael Ruse, who actually spoke here a few years ago. He refers to this idea of the two root metaphors of the Western philosophical tradition. And one of them on the left, the organism, and on the right, the sort of Cartesian thinking, so much a part of our machine-like world today. Really, it's the metaphysics of two-body systems. The problem is that human persons don't really fit into either of those two big categories. They certainly don't really fit into just geometry, but they don't fit into biology alone either. There is a hint that's given to us in the 13th century that persons are really very different even from the Aristotelian biological prototypes. And there's a phrase that Aquinas uses almost in passing. He refers to the persons as subsisting relations. And it's novel because in Aristotelian philosophy, relation was an accident of substance. In Aquinas' proposal, a person is a relation. But what does it mean? How do we understand this claim? Just, again, in passing, I used to be a particle physicist about 20 years ago, and there is at least one other area of reality where we tend to think in terms of subsisting relations, and that's actually the very structure of matter itself at its deepest level. persons are irreducible, but if they're subsisting relations, we have a kind of model in physics. So the smallest known, one of the smallest stable structures is the proton, and the proton, as far as we know, has 3 quarks in it. At least we can bounce beams of particles off the quarks, but we can't separate them. And if you look at the data tables, you often find that the masses of the quarks carry a big question mark or large error bars. Really, it has no meaning. The quarks just don't exist in isolation. They are relational beings, so to speak. So summing up the situation, first part. Our experience of persons is unique and irreducible, but when we try to express what it is to be a person, our usual tools of analysis tend to break in our hands. At least part of the problem, I suggest, is that the philosophical tools we are accustomed to use are grounded ultimately in these 2 main metaphors, the organism and the machine. And as a result, the term person, as it's being used in discourse today, has become orphaned, both from its theological roots and also from everyday experience. Recent research, however, may offer a way forward. So the empirical study of the second-person perspective. It's commonplace in daily life we denote other persons as you, who are present to us in some way and whom we wish to address. But such denotations seem very peculiar if we try to render them in wholly objective terms, like a view from nowhere. So St. Augustine would be unlikely to consider that his famous prayer, "Late have I loved you," is equivalent semantically to, "There is a person, I, who's been late in loving another person, you." In 20th century philosophy, the peculiarity and possible primacy of second-person relatedness was highlighted, of course, in the pioneering work of Martin Buber. In recent years, I think for many years, this whole area remained of interest, but a little bit idiosyncratic. But in recent years, research in social cognition, and in particular joint attention, have, I think, begun to put work on second-person relatedness on an empirical basis. Joint attention involves attending to something with someone else, but also conveys a sense of a meeting of minds. Infants typically begin joint attention at a very young age. We actually have an example down here called Gabrielle, who initially started by not observing the world at all except for faces. And gradually, Gabrielle's perception has broadened out into other things, but faces came first. As a working definition, Professor Peter Hobson, who will be talking here later, he suggested that joint attention can be described as a sharing and awareness of the sharing of the focus, and something which often entails sharing an attitude towards the thing or event in question. So there we've got our 2 children who become symbols of the conference, and here you see there's a shared awareness of the sharing of focus, and it's sharing an attitude towards the thing or event in question. But in that sharing, what's interesting also is this kind of union between the 2 of them, an immediate union. Now, this whole phenomenon of joint attention seems to be related to the second-person form in various ways. So it's natural for us to use the second-person form in grammar with other persons with whom we are engaging in joint attention. So you're looking at this toy, or this toy is for you, and so on. And some philosophers and psychologists have begun to speculate that second-person grammatical forms actually get started in language precisely through this joint attention relationship. Or they've questioned how they could get started in the absence of this relationship. And this is where the whole subject of autism comes in. I'm very grateful to Professor Eleanor Stump, who will again be speaking later in this conference, for introducing me to an extraordinary book called The Siege by Clara Claiborne Park. And if you're not aware of this book, it's the autobiographic account of a mother bringing up an autistic child. And this was at a time when there wasn't that much known about autism, and she really didn't know what she was dealing with, and so she had to gradually work it out for herself. And she was a very meticulous observer of what was going on. And this is one of the first things she noticed that flagged up for her that there was something missing. At the age of 2, she'd never seen her daughter point. Now, as she then goes on to remark, to point is so simple, it's so spontaneous, it's so primary in action, it seems almost ridiculous to analyze it, which is why we don't until it's missing. So all babies point, do they not? And then she goes on to say, well, this stretches the self out into the world. It calls the world to another's attention. And it's the key to unlock so much of the way that we learn about the world and possibly also acquire language. So from pointing comes the question, what's that which unlocks the varied world? Now, in recent years, Park's observations have been confirmed by careful empirical tests. A diagnosis of autism is strongly correlated, may even be defined by a failure to engage in joint attention. Now, there are a few more subtleties, and here I'm grateful to some experiments reported by Peter Hobson. We now know that autistic children have no problem recognizing persons as unique kinds of beings in the world. There are all kinds of subtle tests with point light experiments, and they perform just as well as any other children in identifying that there's a person there. But what they do have a difficulty with, first of all, actually all kinds of things pick up emotional states, they don't do that, but they also have a peculiar difficulty understanding the use of the second person form in grammar. So they quite often use the you form in a third personal way. So if I say, well, how is the jug of water? The jug of water is fine. How are you? You is fine. They don't actually do the switching that would normally be required in second person grammatical forms. And so this empirical observation in conjunction with empirical reflection on a link between joint attention and the use of the second person in grammar suggests that autism inhibits specifically second person relatedness. And this is how Hobson describes one of his rather subtle experiments. The children are asked to copy a particular experimenter, and they copy the actions, they copy the goals, but they do it as a detached observer. And the way he describes it, the children were not moved. The children were not moved. Well, this has become a means and a motive to study second-person relatedness empirically and its role in personal development. We can now separate out the signal from the noise, because in everyday human interactions, there's so many different things going on, it's normally very hard to pick out the second-personal part. Well, now we can, I think, because there are experiments, situations where that relationship is missing. It's not the only condition to teach us about the second person. Adam Green, who spoke at this conference last year, refers to Williams syndrome, characterized, among other things, by hyperattention to faces. So that's almost the second-person relationship getting out of control without corresponding first-person development. There are also other conditions like face blindness and so on. Now, in this third part, I want to just briefly describe one way I've been putting this to use in research over recent years. And this is the application of the second-person insights into virtue ethics. Just returning briefly to the theology and the connection between theology and the person, revealed theology required the notion of a person, but it wasn't just a new category that was introduced. There's also a change in grammar. And to see a contrast here, I invite you to look at, there's a short passage from Aristotle and a short passage from Augustine. Some people say it's a passage between someone who believes in God and someone who doesn't. The Greeks were not talking about God. Actually, no, they do. They do talk about God, but they do talk about God in a particular kind of grammatical way. So Aristotle says God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration, continuous and eternal, belong to God, for this is God. That's Metaphysics, book 12. But look at the change of grammar. This is Augustine in his Confessions. Late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I've burned for your peace. the grammar alone marks this out as so different from the writings of pagan antiquity. And the prominence of the second-person grammatical form is not just in these texts, the Gospel of John, particularly chapters 14 to 17, but also I think it also influenced literature in so many ways. You can see it, for example, in Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more fair. It's influenced all kinds of other areas of culture. I'd love to talk more about this, but I just highlight one that I find particularly striking, which is the art of killing people. So the art of killing people for the pagans, pagan Romans, basically they invented the legion. And the legionary was trained as a kind of depersonalized killing machine. At the end of 5 years, you could order a legionary to go out and walk over a cliff, and he'd obey you. When people started to have armies who were deeply affected by this way of thinking, what's interesting is how they reinvented the art of soldiery. So instead of the legionary, you had the knight. And the knight is nothing if not a personality. And there was even a blend of things that would never normally be expected together, like the soldier and the romantic. Curiously enough, by the way, a little snippet from history. After the Battle of Hastings, the Norman knights all engaged in severe penance to pray and make reparation for all the people that they killed in battle. Now, in recent years, I've argued that second-person relatedness, and it's not Aristotelian virtue ethics, is the key to understanding what Aquinas was talking about in his account of human flourishing, and particularly its structure of virtues, gifts, beatitudes, and fruits. And I published a book on this last year. It's only the first sketch of a research program that could be really expanded. I'll just present this very briefly. I presented this before, but it's just give a little bit of the context of the background. The challenge we've faced for the last 7.5 centuries is to understand what Aquinas was talking about by a virtue. And this is embarrassing because we've been reading him for so long and in such detail. The problem is that when Aquinas talks about a virtue, the things he's describing are so different to those of Aristotle. So, for example, children or the intellectually disabled can receive virtues, according to Aquinas, whereas for Aristotle it was really the summit of a long period of preparation. It was normally a few male members of a polis who were citizens who would really be regarded at the summit of virtue. For Aquinas, the virtues are unified by love and not just by prudence. Most mysteriously, he thinks they can be lost immediately as virtues, or they can be acquired immediately by infusion. And that is such a strange thing in contrast to the slow acquisition of virtues in Aristotle. When one starts to analyze the structure of Aquinas' virtue ethics, it's enormous, by the way. A lot of our students at undergraduate level, when they study Aquinas, they start and probably often end with his 5 proofs for God's existence, which I'm always worth pointing out is actually only one article. He wasn't that interested in that. That's part of the preliminary work. He wrote 1,006 articles on the virtues and associated matters. And a lot of this stuff isn't that well read. What he interweaves actually 4 things together. He interweaves virtues and these 3 other mysterious things, gifts, beatitudes, and fruits, into an organic whole. The problem has been getting us a metaphor for understanding what he's doing. We have no problem cataloguing what he's been saying. We have manuals of moral theology that have been sitting in libraries for centuries, but we don't really have an understanding, a picture of what he was doing. And so the picture is still Aristotelian by default. And it's really temperance by default. That's actually the metaphoric understanding that's influenced virtue ethics in the Western world. Aquinas says the key to understanding the virtues is to look at the gifts and how these things work together. And what he says about the gifts is that they cause a person to be moved by God. But what does it mean to be moved in this sense? So here's the situation. Aquinas thinks that a person with the virtues has some stance towards an object, but with the gifts and the infused virtues, God moves the person with respect to the object. But getting this understanding of what this movement means has been quite difficult. Well, here's one way you might be moved by an all-powerful agent. You might be a puppet, and you might have strings that are causing you to like or dislike various things. But Aquinas rules that model out. He also rules out, more subtly, the information model. There's actually the idea that we may have sort of radio antennas, spiritual radio antennas in our heads to pick up information from God about what things are good and bad and so on. And he says that's wrong as well. What I suggest, the metaphor, the proper understanding actually comes from joint attention. And basically, what the moral and the virtues and the gifts do in Aquinas' account of human flourishing is bring us into joint attention relationship with God. And what was rather beautiful about doing this was it's possible to take material that was written back in the 13th century and relate it immediately to the stuff that's now being done in modern experimental psychology. And there's this beautiful matching up of the key characteristics. The idea of the meeting of minds with the other person. The idea of the sharing in the psychological orientation of the other person. And the other person as experienced as immediately present in some sense. All these things also back in Aquinas' work. And the various gifts, which he says are key to the virtues, can be regarded as taking on God's stance towards various things in his theological system. So, for example, the gift of fear is not fear for oneself, but almost a kind of disappointment from the point of view of the other person. And when you start to explore this theme, you realize actually the artists may have got there first, and there are all kinds of instances, possible instances of theistic joint attention in art. Here's two examples: Rublev's Icon of the Trinity and the Garden of Eden by Jacob de Backer. So, and this is just one example of this kind of interdisciplinary research. I've concluded that second-person relatedness, a kind of relationship investigated today by science in the study of joint attention, is an appropriate metaphor for understanding Aquinas' account of the life of virtue. And from this perspective, losing these gifts could be described as a kind of spiritual autism. Of course, having made this connection, then that really throws a lot of the theological literature and a lot of the moral theology into a completely different context. I'll just point out one thing that fascinated me, and that was Dante's account of limbo. Because Dante wrote this, he goes through every state of the human soul in his poem, and one state looks like paradise. And they go to this place which of green fields, and the heroes of virtue are there, and they're illuminated by the life of glory, but they're actually in the first circle of hell in Dante's account. And what's going on, I think, is a state that's it's actually like a kind of it's a state of spiritual autism to God, but natural perfection, a kind of state of pure nature. And what's it's interesting, Dante used the same image that Clara Claiborne Park used in her book, The Siege. She said, we must lay siege to the citadel. And Dante actually places a citadel in his account of limbo. Now, from this, of course, there are all kinds of other strands that could be explored in theology and have begun to be explored in theology. I just mentioned one of them. If the life of nature is unsatisfactory from God's perspective, God might permit it to be unsatisfactory from our perspective to encourage us to receive grace. And from this point of view, one could begin to construct a theodicy, as Professor Stump has done in her book, Wandering in Darkness. So maybe there's a certain amount of natural lack of flourishing may encourage second personal flourishing. But I think beyond the theological implications, there are broader philosophical possibilities that have only really begun to be explored. And I'd like to suggest that we may be on the brink of a kind of Copernican revolution of the virtues. What seems to be emerging from philosophy and science and theology is the extent to which persons are constituted relationally, specifically in terms of an I-thou relation. What it means to be a person, to flourish as a person, and to attain that flourishing are all inherently second personal. Now, in Christian theology, the second person's principally God. But of course, in developmental psychology, the second person could be a parent or a caregiver. But in both instances, it's that relationship, the second person relationship, which is key to development. And this insight, I suggest, may provide a new and non-Aristotelian approach to virtue ethics that switches from the first to the second person perspective. So, for example, the moral life of babies, the effects of autistic spectrum disorder on moral perception. This is a huge area that's beginning to be explored, and there are certain virtues which are particularly second-personal: humility, gratitude, mercy, revenge, envy, covetousness, modesty, and so on. These are things we can begin to explore by seeing what happens when the second-person relationship is inhibited or absent in certain ways. But there's also a practical, everyday sense of these things. I have 5 nieces. Nieces coming out my ears. And what's fascinating is to see how they acquire temperance. Now, those of you who studied Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics will know his account. We use our practical reason to choose a proper mean, and then by gradual habituation we become used to that mean until it becomes second nature. Well, I've watched my nieces, and that's not how they acquire temperance. This is how they acquire temperance, first of all. Their parents pretend to play a game. Normally the spoonful of food is a train or something like that, and they try to get the child to eat properly in relation to this game. But the child is not really interested in the food, the child is interested in the interaction with the parents. So even temperance, which is the archetypal Aristotelian virtue, when you look at how it's actually acquired in daily life, you find actually the account Aristotle gave isn't the whole story. And so I suggest there's a need for a Copernican revolution of the virtues. And we need to start looking at the world with different eyes. I'll just trace a few brief social implications of the second person perspective as well. If second person relationship is intimately linked to what it means to flourish as a person, I suggest that culture should be cautious of anything that inhibits such relatedness. So concealment, degradation of the human face. We know from history it's often used as a prelude to a suspension of certain kinds of morality. And we can also see perhaps an effect on our culture as the decline of the perception of a certain mode of relationship to God declines as an effect on the way we perceive the natural world. So here's some examples. Obviously, the Venetian Carnival. If you want to get rid of your inhibitions, you stick a mask on. So suddenly there's a breaking of normal second-person relationship, and people then go a little wild. I've put up there a symbol from the famous book 1984, George Orwell. Those of you who remember reading the book will remember the account of the interrogator towards the end, O'Brien, who makes his boast to Winston Smith. Here's the picture of the future, Winston, a boot stamping on a human face forever. That's the picture of the future. Again, attack on second-person relationship. Something of the effect of second-person relationship and its loss can also, I think, be seen in art. This sequence sometimes makes people a bit annoyed, so I do apologize in advance. But back 500 years ago, our understanding of human flourishing, or the understanding of human flourishing that was deeply embedded in Western consciousness, was closely linked to second-person relationship to God and relationship to other people in the light of that relationship to God. So this is, in fact, the most theologically perfect symbolic picture of heaven that any artist probably has ever produced. It's the Van Eyck mystic lamb. Now, what's curious is to see here the idea of nature perfected, the saints, with their individual personalities gathered in paradise around the Lamb of God. Now, what's curious in the 16th century is how this theme gradually changes. And I found 2 transition pictures in the Met in New York. This is the penitence of St. Jerome in 1524, and here the saints are becoming much smaller, and the landscape's becoming much bigger. By the late 16th century, the second-person relationship to God has ceased to be an important theme. What you've actually got, obviously, the joy, the wonders of creation are there, the joys of the harvest, There's a hint of a church in the background, but very much that's been eclipsed. And this opens the age, the golden age, one might say, of natural theology. In the 19th century, produced in the 19th century some of the most beautiful landscape painting ever, like Constable's The Hay Wain. Absolutely stunning, of course, but there's nothing to do with what was traditionally associated with the second person relationship to God, sacraments or saints or crosses or all these sorts of things have all gone. It's insofar as any hint of any theistic element, it's the God of creation and nothing more. By the late 19th century, something curious happens to landscape painting, and here's the last picture Van Gogh painted before he committed suicide. What's significant here, I think, the road is going nowhere, and the picture is beginning to lose its integrity. By the middle 20th century, at least some pictures in the accepted canon of art look like this. This is Jackson Pollock's Enchanted Forest. I do apologize to purists among you. I've turned it on its side. I'm not saying that this is totally without value, but I think you will all agree there's been a change. There has been a change. But I think there's also change happening in society. Just a few years ago, for those of you from other countries who've traveled to the conference from other countries, it's almost as if we had a civilizational pause on the streets of London for about 5 days. And things were just beginning to get out of control during the London riots. And there were all kinds of stories of brutality, of people not caring for their neighbours. There was a kind of nihilism went wild on the streets of London for a few days. It's calmed down now. But again, there was a loss of this care for the other person, sympathy for the other person, and so on, and social chaos. So I said at the beginning, this was an introductory talk. I've just highlighted a few of the areas that I've been working on that I think are promising. But I want to just sketch out very briefly at the end a few of the possible future directions of research before I hand on to Professor Raymond Tallis. I suggest that future research into second-person relatedness can be, and probably ought to be, highly interdisciplinary. So here are some possible areas. Obviously, in neuroscience, great progress is being made. Although one has to be careful, I've discovered, when you look at the references of things that advertise themselves as social cognition in neuroscience, you often find that there isn't really as much as one might expect of the real second-personal stuff. It tends to be, there is a danger of second-person language being reduced to third-person categories again. It's hard to get at the real meat. In experimental psychology, I think there's very promising work, and there's a lot more that could be done with the various conditions that highlight what is distinctive about second-person relationship. There's also social cognition in animals. We had an Ian Ramsey Centre seminar here a few months ago, and Jean Porter came from Notre Dame University, and we were talking about whether animals could be moral. And one of the things that came up in the questions and answers were the examples of some animals that seem to have a certain moral imprint. So in stained glass windows of some saints, you occasionally find their dogs are with them. And on the other point of view, on the other side of things, there are some horrific stories of the dogs that were used in the concentration camps. And it's almost as if the dogs have taken on the imprint, to some extent, of the morality of their owners, not genuinely making moral choices, but taking on a certain imprint. Now, what's interesting, I'd like to suggest speculatively, is that certain animals that have interacted with us for many, many thousands of years have been able to pick up the cues that we use for second-person relationship, and to some way are able to actually sort of tap into those things and almost take on a certain moral imprint from us. So if there are 1,000 sticks on the floor of a forest, your dog is interested in the stick that you are interested in and in no other stick. And of course, far more areas of theology still to be explored with this wonderful new toolkit, issues of nature and grace, suffering, determinism, free will, and so on. And around them all, of course, we need to improve our philosophical tools. there's been some pioneering work, Stephen Darwell's work on the second-person standpoint, developments in the philosophy of language, and the language of philosophy. Well, what do you think? I think there's an extraordinary potential for interdisciplinary work on the second-person perspective. That's why we organise this conference. My hope for the future is to establish a research programme at Oxford very much focused on this theme. Now, my hope for this conference is that your papers and the feedback you give us will help us to establish some priorities for this work. And so in advance, I do encourage, or first of all, I encourage you to give us your feedback, interact during the conference, and I thank you in advance for your contributions. Thank you very much.